Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first panel of three hosted by the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, which is going to be thinking through the politics of elections, the aftermaths and afterlives of elections. And today we start with a conversation about popular mobilization and electoral politics that situates the relationship between mobilization and elections in global and comparative context. Before I introduce our panelists today, I just want to thank first our co-sponsors, the Posen Center, Family Center for Human Rights, the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, the Chicago Center on Democracy, and UChicago Votes. I'll say a bit more about UChicago Votes in just a second, but I also want to thank Anna Jones and Carlo Diaz, 3CT, as well as Joe Bonney, EOS Trinidad, Vera Bellinson, and others who've been working so heroically to put this event together. So UChicago Votes has asked us to make a small announcement. They're a nonpartisan voter engagement initiative working to make UChicago a national leader in voter registration and turnout. So you can go to uchicago.turbovote.org. I think the link will be also in the chat to register to vote and get election deadline reminders. Also a reminder that you can vote early in Hyde Park at the Ray School starting on October 14th. And you can follow UChI Votes on Facebook and Instagram to get more information. So now I have the honor of introducing our four panelists. It's a real pleasure to have them here with us, and I want to thank them for adding yet another Zoom event to their calendar. So first we have Nusrat Sabina Chaudhry, who is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Amherst College. She studies and teaches on topics such as protest, popular sovereignty, and political communication. Her first book, Paradoxes of the Popular Crowd Politics in Bangladesh, was published last year from Stanford University Press, and it's an anthropology of crowds, a permanent fixture in South Asian democratic life. Her current book project explores the concept of sacrifice in relation to development mega projects in Bangladesh by looking closely into the role and ruse of language, of rumor, policies, politics, and international law. This new work is situated within a wider field of the philosophy of post-colonial development. We also have Gianilda Maria Gonzalez, who's an assistant professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Her research focuses on policing, state violence, and citizenship in democracy, examining how race, class, and other forms of inequality shape these processes. Gonzalez's forthcoming book, and her first book, Authoritarian Police and Democracy, Contested Security in Latin America, is forthcoming with Cambridge University Press. And there she studies the persistence of police forces as authoritarian enclaves in otherwise democratic states, demonstrating how ordinary democratic politics and unequal societies can both reproduce authoritarian policing and bring about rare moments of expansive reforms. Gonzalez has received her PhD in politics and social policy from Princeton University. And before joining Harvard Kennedy School, she was a colleague here as an assistant professor at the School of Social Service Administration. Gonzalez's work previously worked at a number of human rights organizations, both in the US and Argentina, including the New York Civil Liberties Union, Andes, and Equipo Latinoamericano de Justicia y Género. Sorry for my terrible Spanish there. And we also have with us Maurice Mitchell. Maurice is a nationally recognized social movement strategist, a visionary leader in the movement for Black lives, and a community organizer for racial, social, and economic justice. Born and raised in New York to Caribbean working class parents, Maurice began organizing as a teenager and never stopped. As a high school student, Maurice served as student leader for the Long Island Student Coalition for Peace and Justice. At Howard University, after a classmate was killed by police officers, he led organizing efforts against police brutality and for divestment from private prisons. Maurice went on to work as an organizer for the Long Island Progressive Coalition, downstate organizing director for Citizen Action of New York, and director of the New York State Civic Engagement Table. Two tragedies changed the course of Maurice's life. In 2012, Hurricane Sandy destroyed Maurice's home in Long Beach, New York, and left him living in hostels for months. 18 months later, after Mike Brown was killed by police in Missouri, Maurice relocated to Ferguson to support organizations on the ground. Seeing the need for an anchor organization to provide strategic support and guidance for the movement for Black Lives activists across the country, Maurice co-founded and managed Blackbird. He was a key organizer of the Movement for Black Lives Convention in Cleveland in 2015. And in 2018, he took the helm of the Working Families Party as national director, where he's applying his passion and experience to make the WFP the political home for a multiracial working class movement. And last but not least, we have Jeffrey Paller, who's assistant professor of politics at the University of San Francisco. He specializes in African politics and sustainable urban development, and his research examines the practice of democracy and accountability in urban Africa. He conducted fieldwork in Kenya, Ghana, Uganda, and South Africa. He recently published the book, Democracy in Ghana, Everyday Politics in Urban Africa, which came out last year with Cambridge University Press. His new project examines the contentious politics of African urbanization. He has received funding from the Social Science Research Council, National Science Foundation, and the University of Wisconsin. He has publications in Polity, Comparative Politics, African Studies Review, Journal of Modern African Studies, and Africa Spectrum. Also, for those interested, he has an excellent weekly news bulletin called This Week in Africa. So thank you all for joining us, and I'll hand it over to Nusrat to get us started.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to participate and to learn from my colleagues, and also giving me this opportunity to come back, return to Hyde Park, even if virtually, which is always a pleasure. So the initial prompt for today's panel was the question, how electoral politics have spurred popular mobilizations around the world, and my area is South Asia. And of course, the related question is how and when do popular mobilizations make elections happen? So in the case of South Asia, which is what I will be talking about today, elections have often been seen as the media through which subjects become citizens. For example, during decolonization, and also how the crowds can be disciplined into becoming rights-bearing citizens. And these are struggles that are still, at least the latter is a struggle that's actually ongoing, and I'll try to give some examples later on. So the focus on the electoral role in newly independent India, for example, or the politics around voter ID cards, most recently in the last decade in Bangladesh, about which I write in my book, or the most recent Citizenship Amendment Act protests in India, show how the popular demands for rights and inclusion pivot on the question of citizenship. And elections seem to offer that to a large number of people, at least symbolically. Saying this, however, is not to fetishize the procedural that often influences the way certain scholars and definitely mainstream media think about elections and other democratic institutions. Elections in South Asia, for example, are thought about simultaneously as festive, colorful, ritualistic, corrupt, well organized, especially when you think about the number of people who actually vote, and violent. The region, despite its size, is also quite varied in terms of its relationship to democracy. India is obviously the largest democracy in the world, and with more than 700 million voters, and in the general election, it is actually the largest organized event in the world, as Mugulika Banerjee writes in her book. Other South Asian countries have experienced regular military rule, such as Pakistan and Bangladesh, attempted military coups, as in Nepal, as in the Maldives and Sri Lanka, and have had some kind of, some form of monarchy, as in Nepal and Bhutan. The variation is striking But what is also striking are the similarities in which people participate in elections, some of the aesthetic forms that this participation actually takes, and how culturally specific and non-universal this concept of universal adult suffrage actually can be on the ground. So I will briefly touch on a few points that might help us understand the relationship between the elections and popular politics in South Asia. I'm not going to go by country, by country, because I don't think there's enough time for that. So I will be touching on some main points that we can elaborate on later on. So one of the premises that long dictated scholarly work on elections in the non-Western or previously colonized part of the globe is how colorful they are, or how they challenge some of the normative assumptions of liberal democracy. So it's interesting to explore the history of the concept or the practice of universal adult franchise in order to show that we can talk about elections in different parts of the world without exoticizing them if we actually understand how some of the constitutive paradoxes that marked its emergence in its birthplace, which is Euro-America, so that the so-called non-West doesn't seem as different or as exotic. To make this point, I would like to refer to Kevin Duong's recent wonderful essay on the history of universal adult franchise, in which he dispels some of the myths around the origin of the electoral process and popular voice. And Duong shows how through careful research that the revolutionary impetus behind universal suffrage actually came at the cost of a weakened, or what he calls an emaciated, democratic imagination. Even in France, as Pierre Rosa Vallot argues, and Duong cites him, the advent of universal suffrage initiated a major revolution, but it came at the cost of abstraction, by which he means an abstracting man, or I would add woman, down to a number. And Duong uses a number of images of from early 19th century US and France. They show how election days used to be civic festivals. They were ritual verifications of the truth that public authority derived from popular voice or vox populi. Whereas in the 20th century, that festive experience of voting kind of forfeited its aura to something more routine, something more serialized and individuating. Some of the images that the elections here in the United States, for example, create some of the images that conjure, that we can conjure when we think about elections in the United States, for example. But voting used to be a public process. It was an activity that assembled people. To vote was not to speak as an isolated person, but to contribute to a process of articulating the shared voice of the people. And this happened on both sides of the Atlantic. However, by 1900, we know every state, virtually every American state was using secret ballots. So how does that history help us understand what's happening elsewhere in the world? So if we start, from ethnographic examples of elections in South Asia, particularly in India, we see that the electoral process or the election itself still possesses some of the oratic that seems to have been lost in the kind of Euro-American tradition of elections. So Mukulika Banerjee has a famous book called Why Indians Vote, which gives us a lively description of voting in West Bengal, which is an eastern state where it's a national holiday, which by the way is true for the rest of South Asia as well. She studies people in the villages who dress up in new clothes. Women who don't generally go beyond their households are actually venturing out to cast their vote. And the anthropologist is very clear about not reading this as an instance of a faith in the democratic process, in the sense that people have faith in the idea that voting would actually change things. Even in contexts where it's obvious that a long-standing incumbent would win the elections, the same kind of aura, the same kind of festivity and energy still surround the elections. So scholars have argued for both for and against the idea of thinking about elections in this part of the world as rituals, kind of in the Durkheimian sense. But if the vote is not the most plausible tool of material improvement, and it isn't, then how does one explain this popular urge to vote? Clearly, an instrumental view is not going to take us anywhere. So it's when we think, and this is Mukulika Banerjee's argument, when we think about the elections as something sacred or sacrosanct, again in the Durkheimian sense, then we can come close to perhaps figuring out why people who stand to benefit the least from voting actually vote. It is a festival of the people, which is something her informants have told her, that it's not for dedicated to any god or goddess. It's a festival of the people, and it is sacred, not necessarily in the religious sense, but in the sense that it is inviolable. And one can also connect kind of the historical dots by looking at Ornit Shani's wonderful book, where she convincingly argues that Indians, after independence or at independence, became voters before they became citizens. And being on the electoral roll was perhaps the only way to prove citizenship. And that's, I think, quite crucial in understanding the status that elections have in South Asia. And this brings me to my last point, in which I want to look at the relationship between popular movements and elections in this part of the world. And we can observe some of the protests that have been raging in South Asia in recent times. And one of the most sustained and powerful one has been in India against the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens, the NRC. Again, some of the problems and aporias that haunted the first elections in independent India, which happened at the end of 1951 and beginning of 1952, still haunt India's struggle for democracy. But once more, these fights for citizenship, these fights for rights are actually taking place outside of the voting booths, right? They're happening on the streets. Things change or have the potential of change only when large number of people occupy public space. These are the crowds of thousands that can challenge election results or can even make them happen. So in other parts of South Asia, popular mobilizations have actually forced military rulers to step down and allow for elections. So popular mobilizations can take place and have a kind of distinct relationship with elections. They can make elections happen, but they can also refute electoral results. So turning these crowds into proper citizens beyond the affiliations of class, caste, citizenship is a task and an ambition that remains incomplete in the context of South Asia. This has long vexed nationalist leaders and anti-colonial activists who subscribed to an idea of developmental democracy and really wondered whether South Asians were ready for democracy in South Asia. And if you follow some of the conversations that are happening around elections in South Asia, where people say that they vote for the symbols, not necessarily for the ideas or ideologies, some of those ideas still circulate around whether South Asians actually are ready to become voters or do have the wherewithal to be certain kinds of citizen to vote. But are people ready to vote in South Asia? That question can only make sense when we also look at the rising authoritarianisms, not just in South Asia, but globally, but others will talk about other parts of the world, and particularly India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka leading the way. The answer is not in the elections anymore, if it ever was. The last two elections in Bangladesh, which is my research site, had zero credibility. The ballot boxes were filled the night before. People bragged on social media about how they voted for 25 people and so forth. And Mukulika Banerjee, who in her book in 2007, 2008, was so celebratory of Indian elections, calling it a festival, calling it sacred. Writing in 2019 has a very different take on what Indian elections have become. She calls it the new Indian election, which has been free but not necessarily fair. She uses a cricket analogy, which is something South Asians, tend to do. And she declares that the last 29 elections, general elections in India, would not even count as a cricket match because it wasn't fair. And also, the other thing we need to think about when we think about South Asian elections or popular politics now, and also in other places, is the introduction of technology. So when we think about EVM, electronic voting machines, Indian elections are now 100% electronic. Electronic voting machines have been introduced in a limited fashion in other parts of South Asia as well, and social media such as WhatsApp. The kind of influence that they have on the way election is managed and the way information or misinformation is circulated is something that we need to think more about and talk more about. What remains somewhat constant, however, is the importance of public assemblies and the power of the popular voice, as we have seen from scholars such as Duong, which was not always represented through universal suffrage. And in the case of South Asia, it has been evident for a long time. So before finishing, I want to touch on the concept of the sacred once more, like, in the way in which Mukulika Banerjee has talked about the elections being sacred. But I also want to broaden the scope of the discussion from elections to democracy itself. And, democracy bears its own talismans. So David Kim and John Jackson have said that democracy's sacrality is a function of the people's capacity to write themselves into protected political existence. So for example, when you look at the Anti-Citizenship Amendment Act protests in India, a secular text that accrued the aura of the sacred has been the Indian Constitution, where thousands chanted the preamble to the Constitution at landmark public assemblies at the height of the protest. They have held copies like a talisman of the text, along with the portraits of its main architect, B.R. Ambedkar. So it's not accidental that some of the people writing about this have also commented that Indians have come under, as people of one book. And kind of the religious connotation of this is unmissable. And the collective recitations of the Constitution actually ritually reproduce the sacred from the profaneness of everyday life. So we need to think about elections both in terms of the sacred, but we also need to think of elections as one among many kind of processes of politics that have an aura of the sacred in various parts of the world. And that doesn't mean that I think South Asia is more religious. It's just that I think the auratic is something that has always surrounded the idea of universal suffrage, something that has kind of maybe disappeared or sidelined in some parts of the world and not others. And it would be wonderful to kind of, as anthropologists, as scholars, to be able to kind of take those much more seriously when we think about something like elections. So we need to think about the aesthetics of elections as well as popular mobilizations, and also the unfinished nature of popular politics, because it looks different. I mean, there are similarities, but there's also a way in which we don't understand how it's going to unfold. And that unfinished nature, I think, makes it impossible for us to have any kind of last word on what popular politics might mean for democracy, either in South Asia or elsewhere. But elections can be one site from which to analyze the significance of some of these political events, elections for sure, but also the kind of popular mobilizations around them. And I think, you know, only a few weeks before the American elections, it's interesting to think about elections in other parts of the world, precisely because American elections have so much significance for the rest of the world. So I would like to stop there for now and maybe elaborate on some of these themes during the discussion session. Thank you.
Great, I think we'll turn to Imelda.
Well, thank you so much, Adam, for inviting me to be part of this really global conversation, sort of about the significance of this moment when we have seen popular mobilizations kind of erupt in different parts of the world in ways that are significant. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to reflect on the Latin American context and the widespread protests that took place between last year and this year in various countries in the region, which have been called by some, at least sort of media and sort of some local political figures and observers, as the Latin American Spring, right, akin to the Arab Spring from just under a decade ago. And so I'm going to speak less about elections as such, although I will speak about their relationship to elections. But I wanted to think about how the recent waves of protests in Latin America in the last couple of years have made us rethink the relationship, or should make us rethink the relationship between protests and democracy relative to how they have traditionally been thought about by Latin American leaders, political elites, academics, and many other observers. And so going back to the sort of early years following the transitions to democracy in the region, protests, sort of widespread street protests were really seen as a threat to democratic stability and institutions. Sort of going back to sort of economic crises in the 80s, large street protests were seen as a danger to new democratic governments who were sort of questioned on their ability to quell this popular unrest. Then in the 1990s, with the sort of neoliberal turn, we saw sort of large proliferation of protests as well, that many of which resulted in the toppling of leaders, that leaders were sort of forced to resign by these mass mobilizations. And this was also seen as a crisis moment, right? And the protests were sort of criticized for, at least in the more academic literature, as undoing in the streets what had been done at the ballot box by the citizenry. And so that's kind of been the relationship between, or had been the relationship between protests, at a very large scale in Latin America, and democracy was seen as a kind of a threat to the stability of emerging democratic institutions and sort of flailing economic systems at the time. But I want to sort of talk about today and reflect with everyone here about how in the last year to year and a half, we've seen that citizens around the region have taken to the streets in a way that's very much in defense of democracy. And I'll discuss some exceptions to that with respect to the far right in Brazil. But essentially, people are not out in the streets to say that democracy is not legitimate, or that democracy is not sort of optimal, sort of that we prefer to go back to this authoritarian period that we had been in. But instead, people are out in the streets demanding that democracy live up to its promises. And the protests, I'm going to go through a couple of sort of snapshots of different countries in the region and show how protests over the last year and a half have been a site of fundamental questioning of dominant institutions and structures that have been constructed over decades in the region, but which had failed to deliver on the promises of democracy, particularly for the young adults who had been born under democracy, but who have seen democratic institutions flounder in the face of corruption, economic crisis, insecurity, as well as crumbling education, employment, and health systems. And so what I want to sort of think about with everyone is how, rather than withdrawing from democracy or turning against democracy, these young people, for the most part, have gone to the streets to hold democratic institutions accountable and to fight for an alternative vision for what democracy can look like in their societies. And an alternative vision that elections alone have done very little to bring about. And so over the past year and a half, we've seen large-scale mobilizations, in some cases the largest protests that have been seen in some of these countries, from Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and Haiti down to Chile. Over the past 2 years, we've seen widespread and prolonged protests that have really seen people take to task the central institutions of Latin American and Caribbean states. And so I'm going to sort of talk about 3 central institutions, the first of which is elections. So I'll talk about a couple of examples of protests being catalyzed by elections, and going out to the streets to not to undo what elections have done, but to demand true, fair, clean elections that can allow people to achieve their visions, their alternative visions for democracy. I'm also going to talk about a few cases where protests go much further than thinking about elections. And in fact, they are really seeking to question the political system as a whole and how they reproduce inequality and corruption in their countries. And I'll talk a couple of examples of that, where sort of it's not just about we want clean elections, but simply we need to have a refounding of our political system. And then finally, sort of as somebody who is focused on policing, I think it's also really important to think about, and particularly because we are in the United States, where we have seen some of the largest mobilizations, or in fact the largest mobilizations in U.S. history over the past few months over police violence. I also wanted to touch upon how protests have centered police violence as a demand, or an end to police violence as a demand. And that's how that has played out in a couple of countries in the region. And so sort of through these sort of 3 central institutions, or questions that people are raising about central institutions, I wanted to sort of think about this argument that protests in Latin America today are, rather than destabilizing, are actually very much a sign for hope for democracy in the region. And so to begin with, I wanted to talk about, as I said, a couple of cases. These are by no means the only ones, but just a couple of cases where protests are being catalyzed by fraudulent elections. And neither of those 2 are, of course, new in the region. Fraudulent elections and large protests are par for the course in Latin America, but there seems to be sort of a new set of actors that have emerged in many contexts in response to elections, to, as I said, sort of demand a new approach. And so here folks are going to the streets not as an alternative to elections, but to really uphold the legitimacy of elections and demand that legitimacy be upheld by government officials, right? So here we're seeing people hitting the streets in defense for democracy after clear instances of the elections being undermined by state actors. And so the first case I'll talk about is the Dominican Republic, where we saw earlier this year in the pre-COVID era, we saw municipal elections in February of this year that were plagued with questions, where there were sort of very stark electronic problems that had emerged with the voting machines. So hours into the voting on election day, voters in 60% of voters around the country saw errors in their ballots, where they only saw partial lists of parties and candidates. And while people were actually still in line waiting to vote, the government decided to suspend the elections sort of as they were in progress. And so given that the same political party had been in power for 16 years, people really distrusted the decision to cancel the elections by this electoral institution. And almost immediately, we saw thousands of young Dominicans hit the streets to demand answers and the integrity of elections. And this was a really significant moment because the Dominican Republic doesn't really have a history of large protests, and certainly not by sort of well-to-do middle-class students, young people of this sort. And yet here we saw very high-profile protests of young people occupying the Plaza de la Bandera, the flag square, for weeks, and they were joined by high-profile, prominent Dominican celebrities. And one of their clear demands was greater social and political equity and a better quality of democracy overall. And all of this it was incredibly novel in a country that had seen that had really had a halting trajectory to democracy, and that had struggled to, and still struggling to, shed its authoritarian past, and had constructed, of course, a political and economic system that sustained very high rates of poverty and inequality. And so this social movement, which came to be called La Plaza Alzada, sort of the square rises up, people really sought a change to this model, right? So here we see, as I was saying, sort of a relationship of protests being catalyzed by elections, but really referring to much broader failures of the political system. We also have a similar sets of prolonged protests being catalyzed by elections in in Bolivia, though in a much even more dramatic way. About a year ago, you might recall that Evo Morales, the long-running first indigenous president of Bolivia, had sought re-election to a fourth term, and under accusations of fraud in that election, including accusations levied by the Organization for American States, he was compelled to resign. And so this led to a lot of upheaval, and similarly, as in the DR, triggered ordinary Bolivians, particularly those who for the first time saw themselves represented in the MAS, the political party of Evo Morales, went out into the streets. And so what seems to be a familiar story in Latin America over the last century, right? Outside intervention and military elite cooperation to take over power, also had sort of a novel component with it that went along with it, which was popular social movements going out into the streets to once again defend the integrity of elections and demanding timely, fair elections to elect a new leader. And so even just more recently, people have gone to the streets to ensure that protests happen within this year. And so later this year, later this month, we'll see the elections in Bolivia and sort of see what will come of that. But essentially, this is sort of an instance of protests that seem to be about elections, but are really about the protection of democracy and having a democracy that is truly living up to its promises. I wanted to then just quickly give a couple of examples of another set of cases that, like DR and Bolivia, which are not cases that we tend to think about together, are of cases in which large-scale protests emerged, but that really came to challenge the political system as a whole. And that people were questioning entrenched power structures that have persisted for decades and contributed to the reproduction of widespread, very high levels of inequality and corruption. So while the Bolivian and Dominican cases that I mentioned previously did have, of course, broader sets of grievances regarding the economic and political system, in these cases, elections were not the catalyst, and they were always very clear from the start about the broader causes and demands that they were leveraging, and that they were really calling not just for make sure you schedule elections in a timely manner and that they are clean and fair, but rather people are calling for a refounding of the political system. And so the first of these that I'll mention is Puerto Rico, which, sort of since the 2008 financial crisis has really been in a constant, a frequent state of of upheaval and crisis, and mismanagement of the governance of the island. But 2019 was a really striking moment because we saw very large scale protests um, being led by kind of not political parties, not the traditional political actors, but sort of young people with, in a way that sort of mimics or mirrors what we've seen sort of in the US with like Black Lives Matter, where there's not like one clear sort of lead to it. We saw sort of a leaderless protest movement emerge in Puerto Rico. And it was something that, although these protests initiated to demand the resignation of the governor following sort of a scandal of released text messages between him and his close associates, the protests really quickly became about questioning the entire system of governance in Puerto Rico, including, of course, the relationship to the United States, which more recently has come to be represented by a fiscal control board that has imposed very dire austerity measures with zero input from, zero democratic input. And so it has exacerbated, in many people's minds, the previous economic hardship and suffering caused by the financial crisis and, of course, Hurricane Maria. And so these protests really generated a new set of political actors, including sort of new candidates that are presenting themselves for election in the upcoming November 3rd election. And so not only, sort of in mainland United States, are we sort of on the lookout for what is going to be the future of this country? It's really, there's a lot at stake in Puerto Rico as well to sort of see whether the sort of old guard or this sort of new emerging political movement will sort of prevail. A similar sets of questioning, I think I'm coming up on time, so I might just sort of quickly summarize a couple of the other two cases that I wanted to talk about, which are Colombia and Chile. Two very high profile cases, particularly the Chilean case last year of sort of what are called the estallido social, these sort of social explosions as the Chilean sets of protests had been called. Countries in Latin America that are very different, but that we're seeing very similar moments of nationwide large scale mobilization to question political systems that reproduce, once again, as in the Puerto Rican case, sort of large scale inequality and fundamentally deprive most citizens of a quality of life. And so I might sort of focus here on the Chilean case because when we're thinking about democracy and popular mobilization, the Chilean case is one in which democracy emerged through a pact with the outgoing authoritarian leaders. And so the Pinochet regime really shaped and had a chance to determine many, many aspects of what Chilean democracy would look like. And so that led to, of course, sort of the infamous economic system established by, of course, the equally infamous Chicago Boys that made Chile the sort of the stable, economically successful, politically stable country in Latin America, but at the cost of very high rates of inequality, some of the highest in the region, and generated a highly unequal educational systems, health systems, very costly public transportation, and a privatized pension system that excluded most Chileans, again, from any of the promises of democracy. And so we saw the protests in Chile, again, not just being about one election or elections as such, but people were out there demanding just a refounding and new constitutions, a new constitution altogether. And of course, this is highly contested in Chile, but we see that that these protests are not simply about sort of one particular grievance, but that people and young people in particular are thinking in different ways about the kind of society that they want to live in. I'll mention with just, I'll close with just 1 minute on this question of sort of police violence, because these large scale protests, particularly of the sort that I've just mentioned in Puerto Rico, Colombia, and Chile, where the entire political system is sort of under indictment, of sort of a popular indictment, police then situate themselves as the story through widespread repression, et cetera. And so, not surprising, in many of these contexts, we've also seen police themselves become targets for grievance and demands in the face of these protests. And so there's a real continuity between the ongoing protests that began last year in places like Chile and Colombia, and the protests that we're seeing today against police violence. And so now we're seeing sort of for the first time, sort of these large-scale protests where police are at the center and the questioning of police are at the center. And so I think I might be coming up on my time. So I'll just sort of stop by saying that these protests, by questioning these sort of central institutions of democracy, but in a way that seeks to reinforce democracy and defend the legitimacy of democracy rather than pose any kind of threat to it or to democratic stability, we should that should give us some hope, but we also shouldn't be naive about what can be achieved. Not only because of the repression that I've mentioned, but because these protests have also generated important backlash movements of their own. So for example, in Chile, we've seen sort of more well-to-do sectors of society coming out to protest themselves against having a new constitution, claiming that, we don't want to be the next Cuba or Venezuela. We've seen in Brazil, which I haven't talked about, but we've seen people out on the streets protesting, calling for military coups, calling for attacks on the Supreme Court. So we also shouldn't be too naive about what popular mobilization will achieve in these contexts. But at a minimum, what we're seeing in Latin America is a taking seriously by a new generation of people that did not grow up under dictatorship, but who grew up under democracy and that really want that democracy to live up to its promise. And they're using mass mobilization as their instrument for doing so. So I'll stop there and turn it over to back to you, Adam.
Great, thanks, Nilda. I think we're gonna hear from Jeff next.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It feels good to be back in Chicago, where I spent 5 years in my earlier days. The United States is not the only country holding a presidential election in the next few months. Tanzania, Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, and Ghana are too. As Representative Karen Bass discussed in a recent webinar, the US faces similar challenges with Ghana by ensuring a peaceful election and making sure that leaders do not cheat to stay in power. This is true for the other African countries as well. But to really understand the dynamics of elections, it is important to go to the streets, especially to its cities, to understand the dynamics of popular mobilization. Here are 5 points worth noting to better understand African elections, but also to shed light on popular mobilization across the globe. The first is that campaign season is here. Like sports, elections are not just an event, but a season. And campaign season comes early. They start with primaries 2 years out, then registration, polling day, and then the count. For many ordinary Africans, campaigns offer a voice for people at the grassroots, a space for uneducated, informal workers to enter the power structures through its local branches and access higher ups in government who are actually making the real decisions. The candidates often represent a vision of the future of the country, but also a connection to the past. In Ghana, the NDC sees themselves connected to a lineage that dates to Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah, who built an independence movement with the support of Veranda Boys, or a collection of young people in organizations like the Young Pioneers and the Builders Brigade, who sought control over their lives outside of colonial rule, but also outside the traditional leaders and elites who dominated public life. Alternatively, many residents in poor urban neighborhoods tag MPP politicians as arrogant and distant, who speak big English. In the MPP, the youth must wait their turn, and that turn never seems to come. This is despite the fact that many of their public policies, universal public education, improvements in healthcare benefits are all quite similar. Party organizers, often deemed foot soldiers in the public discourse, come from all walks of life. They are market women, fisher folk, Keep Fit members, boxers, rappers, biker boys, fishmongers, assembly persons, footballers, macho men, land guards, fetish priests, tailors, and imams. They gain recognition from the political parties, aim to raise their status in their communities, and often gain valuable resources and government contracts. The parties rely on them for their ability to mobilize votes, but also legitimate their authority at the grassroots. These organizers are not just demanding material rewards, but recognition and respect as citizens of the Ghanaian state. Elections unfold on the streets in what Kathleen Stewart calls a contact zone of analysis. Specific actions and events on the street itself and the subsequent reactions to them change people's decisions and dictate how the process unfolds. The patterns, habits, and discourses help explain whether an election will be peaceful or turn violent. This is because the everyday politics, or how ordinary people act, feel, and think about power on a daily basis in their local spaces, shapes the outcomes and the trajectory of mobilization. Take a look at the video on the screen. This is the parliamentary candidate in Ododo-Diodio constituency doing house-to-house campaigning. Sometimes these events turn tense and violent as supporters carry cutlasses and patrol the streets. The media is quick to magnify any violent events, and parties quickly politicize them. But more often than not, these skirmishes go nowhere, as local opinion leaders from both parties hold peacemaking ceremonies and reach peaceful agreements. The role of local opinion leaders, who has ties to political parties but gain legitimacy elsewhere, play an outsized but understudied role in democratic politics. Innovation is with the opposition. Incumbency advantage is real. Heads of state have the resources, the control of institutions, and the organizational strength to control and coerce. Take Tanzania's John Magufuli, nicknamed the Bulldozer, who has made a mockery of public health recommendations in his COVID-19 response, but will still likely win the election in a landslide. He continues to crack down on the press and the opposition. The innovation really lies with the opposition. But this is an institutional feature of being on the outside looking in at power, rather than anything inherent to the candidates themselves. In 2012, the MPP lost Ghana's election, but contested the results in court. While the MPP lost the case, it contributed to what George Bob Miller and I call a democratic rupture, an infraction in the democratization process during competitive elections that has the potential to cause a constitutional crisis. In turn, the MPP reorganized their party and found new ways to get citizen participation and mobilized. The MPP demanded electoral reforms, reorganized their campaign machinery, refocused its manifesto on jobs and development, engaged new constituencies in the north and in poor urban neighborhoods. These new supporters helped the MPP win the 2016 election by 1 million votes. This year, it's the NDC that has had to retool. After losing the 2016 polls, the NDC went back to the basics. They held listening sessions all over the country to better understand the concerns of voters. This stands in direct contrast to their strategy in 2016 of listing all of their government accomplishments. Flag bearer John Mahama surprised the country by naming Jane Nana Opoku-Agyeman, a well-respected educator and former cabinet member, his vice presidential candidate and the first female in this position in the country's history. Robert Kyagulanyi Ssentamu, also known as Bobi Wine, bought the first Cadillac Escalade in East Africa. He is a 38-year-old musician and activist and is taking on a 75-year-old dictator, Yoweri Museveni, in next year's election in Uganda. Called the ghetto president by his supporters of the People Power movement, Wine brings hope to thousands of youth who envision a new future for the country. Wine's influence is spreading across the country. More than half a dozen artists have announced candidacies for elected office. In a recent Rolling Stones article, Dr. Hilderman, a dancehall artist who is running for parliament as well, said, "Music in Uganda has become another parliament. People expect MPs to represent their views. When they fail to do so, they turn to us as their ambassadors. The people are encouraging us to air out their views, to talk about what they're going through." While Wine has captured the imagination of Ugandans looking for a change and the international community looking for an icon of youth and democracy, hip-populism, or the combination of a hip-hop aesthetic with populist messaging, does not always contribute to good governance. Take Mike Sonko here on the right, who came to power in Kenya as a 35-year-old member of parliament, then county senator, and is now the governor of Nairobi. He is known for his bling and lavish lifestyle, but also his close connections to organized gangs in Nairobi's poorest neighborhoods. He has been accused of drug trafficking, was recently seen slapping a journalist, and was thrown out of Kenya's starchy parliament for wearing ear studs and sunglasses, according to the New York Times. In 2019, he was arrested on corruption charges. Africa is projected to reach 2.5 billion people by 2100, and the majority of people will be less than 35 years old. Many of these people will live in the poorest neighborhoods of cities across the continent. Hip-populism isn't going away anytime soon. Resentment runs deep in African elections. In the case of Cote d'Ivoire, 78-year-old President Alassane Ouattara's decision to contest the upcoming election sparked new tensions on the street and brought back memories of the country's deadly civil war. People on the streets remember the civil war, as well as the deadly post-election violence of 2011 that killed more than 3,000 people. At the grassroots, the politics of resentment takes the shape of a charged us versus them contest. Cote d'Ivoire's economic growth of 8% over the past few years, fueled by cocoa production and infrastructure construction, especially in the capital Abidjan, has put a Band-Aid over the deep social and economic inequalities that still exist in the country. The north-south and urban-rural cleavage magnify these intense disagreements over citizenship and belonging and have reemerged during the recent election campaign. Political scientist Kathy Kramer used the term the politics of resentment to explain the resentment that helps explain Trump's appeal in rural Wisconsin. But across the globe, elections are often understood as an us versus them affair as well.
Great, and we'll close with Maurice Mitchell.
Hello, and thank you, Adam. It's really great to be here. So good afternoon, and thanks for the invite. This is my second C3T event, almost a year after the symposium on multiracial populism that we organized together last year. And I'm not sure if things have turned out the way we anticipated last October. We should kind of go back over our notes, but I think we're in conditions that we didn't prefigure. But I'm very glad to sort of be here alongside, scholars, and especially glad that we're sort of refusing this temptation of American exceptionalism by bringing a global and sort of comparative perspective to bear on our present political predicament. And, I could just personally say, as a child of Caribbean parents whose own diasporic lives and traditions instilled in me a commitment to internationalism and Pan-African solidarity, and as a child of a parent who came from a small island nation that had its own socialist experiment interrupted by sectarian political violence and US imperialism, it's a treat to step outside of the sort of hall of mirrors that is US politics, even just for an hour and a half. So I'm just very grateful for this venue. And just to be clear, I am not a researcher by trade, but as the head of an independent left-wing political party vying for power in a political system that only allows two parties, I do spend a fair amount of my time and energy theorizing about this political system that we're in. And as someone who came to electoral politics by way of social movements, I have a lot to say about the relationship between mass popular mobilization and elections. So what I want to focus my remarks on today is a specific contradiction in US politics and society today that is intensifying almost daily, and which many ultimately participate a real rupture in the political history of the United States. So on the one hand, there's an increasing refusal of indigenous peoples and immigrants, and perhaps especially Black people. That is, all of those whom the racial formation in the US has rendered as inferior, sort of subject populations, all those folks to accept the degraded treatment that racial capitalism has assigned to us, right? On the other hand, a growing movement on the political right has become convinced that white people are under threat, and their only hope of survival in a country undergoing rapid demographic and cultural change is to entrench minority rule. So in this context, something like the fights over Confederate monuments are, in one sense, purely symbolic, and yet what is being symbolized is precisely this struggle over whether this country will ever realize the promise of equal freedom for all of its inhabitants, or whether it will continue to sort of reproduce racial hierarchy as the planet literally burns. So contradiction is the right word for these two phenomena because they are in fact fundamentally irreconcilable, and because dialectically they intensify each other. So this right-wing white backlash and this growing alignment of people of color led by Black folks to resist racial capitalism. Now, without being too arbitrary, let's just start the clock with Barack Obama's election in 2008. His racial liberalism promised equality on the minimal basis of inclusion, but even that was enough to ignite a furious racial backlash in the form of the Tea Party, which saw in Obama's insufficient healthcare plans and non-existent bailouts of homeowners a vision of a Black elected official using the powers of his office to funnel the tax dollars of hardworking white Americans to undeserving people who looked like him. Black people, meanwhile, especially young, poor Black people, saw the biggest decline in Black wealth in modern US history under Obama, and saw how having a Black president did nothing to stop men like George Zimmerman from murdering Black children like Trayvon Martin or Tamir Rice, or police in Ferguson from murdering Mike Brown. The movement for Black lives exploded, and in response to these intolerable conditions, and there are many serious researchers who believe that backlash against the movement for Black lives contributed in some degree to Donald Trump's painfully narrow victory in 2016. So thanks to some of the most anti-majoritarian aspects of the US Constitution, right? So it wasn't just that, and rampant voter suppression, especially of poor Black people in places like Milwaukee and Philadelphia, Trump became president. Trump, as president, has done everything he can do to strengthen minority rule, from all but ending legal immigration and naturalization to undermining the census to ramming through Supreme Court nominations and other lifetime court vacancies, to sabotaging our confidence in the results of our elections in the hope that minoritarian institutions like the Electoral College and the Supreme Court will somehow deliver him a victory. And in his dogged, naked pursuit of minority rule and his callous indifference to the suffering of those he believes not to support him politically, especially Black people, Trump has fueled the movements that are not only determined to oust him, but to force a reckoning with and redress for the living history of systemic racism in this country. The intensification of this contradiction has led us to a place where the leader in the Senate of one of the US's two main political parties is trying to force through a Supreme Court confirmation vote just days before a presidential election. And the president is openly telling his supporters that it's critical to do this because the Supreme Court may well decide the outcome of the election, for the simple reason that the president himself intends to challenge the election's validity. This is happening openly. So 53 Republicans in the US Senate represent 153 million Americans against 47 Democrats who represent 168 million Americans. That just speaks to the stark anti-democratic, minoritarian sort of nature of the Senate as an institution. So Republicans will have chosen, and this is just another data point to drive this home, would have chosen 6 of 9 serving Supreme Court justices, despite having won the popular vote in the presidential election only once in the last 7 rounds. It's a remarkable fact. So what does that mean for electoral politics, especially from the perspective of the left? The first thing to say is that it represents complex and challenging terrain. On the one hand, that core contradiction over the insistence on equal freedom for all and the corresponding determination to preserve minority rule create conditions in which it is all but impossible for those who are committed to racial justice not to be in some sort of coalition with the Democratic Party. If one party is committed to minority rule at your expense and you live in a 2-party system, then you're going to be with the other party. Many people speak of realignment, but they do not always note that while sometimes you're the realigners, just as often you're the realigned. So on the other hand, the seeming inability of the Democratic Party to win, despite going up against a foe whose numbers are manifestly smaller, is a failure driven by the Democratic Party's own fealty to its wealthy backers and professional class constituents. And that failure has helped to spur an electoral insurgency on the left, the likes of which we've never really seen. Last night, for example, I hosted an event to launch the Working Families Party's new platform, the People's Charter, which, by the way, you can and should check out at peoplescharter.us. Among other of our guests, and there are several guests, were numerous guests who are sitting or soon to be sitting Congress people. You had Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, for example. Both of these candidates are unapologetically Black, working class, and radical, and both defeated powerful incumbents who had the full and enthusiastic backing of the Democratic Party. It is my firm conviction that the victories of both of these candidates, as well as dozens of left-wing candidates in state and local races in primaries this spring and summer, were a result of the impossibility of averting one's eyes from the racialization of suffering inflicted by COVID and the economic collapse and the profound sympathy that the uprisings of this summer engendered among Black people in particular, and many more people besides Black folks. This contradiction, and perhaps for the moment, it is a secondary contradiction of the multiracial but mostly white, affluent, and wealthy versus the multiracial but predominantly Black and brown working class within the broad Democratic Party coalition is in itself a dynamic and unpredictable force within our politics. And under certain circumstances, it could become the driving force. So as we look ahead to an election that mainly typically sober-minded people think could lead to full-blown constitutional crisis, in which mass street protests play a decisive role in war-gamed out scenarios, I want to reflect a bit on the dynamic interplay between elections and popular mobilization, looking both at the sort of dynamic that we want to see as well as the ones we might be forced into. The scenario we want to end up in, and that Working Families Party is investing enormous energy and resources into realizing, is a historic collapse of the GOP under the weight of its own racism and racism-fueled hatred of the basic idea of government. As the mainstream press starts to discern that this outcome is a real possibility, they are already pre-writing the history of this election as one in which primarily educated white women in the Sun Belt and suburbs swung away from Trump and the Trumpist GOP, ushering in a moderate Democratic president and a Democratic Senate, which owes its majority to moderates from places like Arizona and Colorado. Now, there are many within the Democratic Party who will opportunistically interpret this outcome as a mandate for restoration and will feel emboldened to resist demands coming from the left for sweeping legislation. Perhaps even more critically, they will resist reforms on counter-majoritarian institutions that would shift the political field in a progressive direction, like ending the filibuster reforming the Supreme Court, including expanding it, admitting Washington, D.C. as a state, and other structural reforms. In this scenario, it's very likely that some of the fire fueling protest movements during the Trump era will subside. Some liberal donors and funders whose hatred of Trump has led them to direct money towards more left forces will return to their comfort zone. And the left will only have a few beachheads within a Biden administration and in Congress. Under those conditions, the extent of progressive advance will depend to a significant extent on the scale of mobilization that movement forces, that outside power can muster. But the left will have assets that we will continue to sort of engage, assets that we didn't have 2008 and 2009. For example, the experience of mobilization in the years since then, and that's been significant. And those beachheads that we do have in Congress and elsewhere, you know, the affectionately entitled squad and the future squad of many of the insurgents that are coming in. They also include the shift that has been happening even within the mainstream of the Democratic Party in realizing that it's impossible to negotiate in good faith with an opposition party that fundamentally does not believe that the majority should rule. And perhaps the key asset we will have is the success we've already achieved in channeling movement energy into insurgent electoral victories. Because now, and this is really important, for the first time in my lifetime, mainstream Democrats feel they have to watch their left flank as well as their right. So a second scenario, which I don't wish to dwell on, both because I think the odds of it happening are decreasing by the day, and because it's depressing to think about, is a clear-cut Trump victory. Since it borders on being a statistical impossibility that Trump will achieve a popular vote plurality, this scenario would almost surely involve massive street protests as people vent their anger and rage at a wildly unpopular president winning a second term due to an 18th century anti-authoritarian constitutional quirk. In this scenario, popular movements would be critical as a break on the sort of retaliatory authoritarianism that Trump and his henchmen, like Bill Barr, would unleash. And this would be a central challenge for institutions like mine. Movements would need to demand accountability from a Democratic Party, which has shown itself incapable of orchestrating electoral victory despite nearly unlimited resources, a historically unpopular opponent, and a 100-year economic collapse. The last scenario, which all of us fear is all too likely, is some sort of contested election. The most likely form of it would take this type of form, something like Trump appearing to hold a narrow lead in states like Pennsylvania on election night, with millions of ballots remaining to be counted. Trump would move quickly to try to get the vote count into the right-wing dominated federal courts, and then Republican operatives at the state and federal level would try to exploit every constitutional ambiguity to ensure that those votes never get counted. Under these circumstances, we can expect a massive mobilization of far-right forces who will attempt to intimidate those whose jobs it is to count the vote. And unlike the so-called Brooks Brothers riot in Florida in 2000, remember that thing? This will not just be a bunch of junior GOP staffers in khakis. And in such circumstance, movement forces will really and truly be faced with the task of actually defending any semblance of democratic rule in this country. Our immediate task will be simple: ensure that every vote is counted, and we will be able to draw on an enormous reserve of righteous rage, especially among Black folks, who know in their bones that some significant part of white America is determined to stop us from exercising our right to vote. Now, I do believe that we will prevail in such a struggle, if only because of just how hated Trump really is. But we will then confront a new and potentially much more profound challenge, which is governing under conditions where 40% of the electorate, give or take, will have convinced themselves that the election was stolen. Our challenge under such conditions will be to navigate a path through the fundamental contradiction that I began with. It will require challenging that fierce determination on the part of Black and brown people to dismantle racial inequity and injustice. And it will require convincing some portion of working class white people that actually challenging and dismantling racial injustice is not a threat to them, but in fact essential to their liberation as well. Because without such a shift, the balance of forces within the Democratic Party will likely remain too weighted towards the right for us to break through with our most transformative and most urgently necessary demands. Due to the serious rupture that would occur in that scenario, our task would be daunted. It would be to reconstruct a functioning polity where racial and urban versus rural, cultural and regional divides do not concretize into hardened tribal bases. It would be a true reweaving of the American identity, a project that will take a generation or more. And it'll be necessary in order to heal what months of electoral contestation, 4 years of proto-fascism, 40 years of neoliberal consensus, and 400 years of racial capitalism have laid bare. So there's lots more to be said, but I'll leave it there and look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much to all the panelists. And if you could all come back live so we can see you. We have a few more minutes for Q&A. And I want to say, first of all, that this conversation, we organized it very intentionally as an attempt to provincialize the United States election and to get us at a moment where we are constantly bombarded by November 3rd and what will happen on November 3rd, to start with a conversation that broadens this out and thinks about more general dynamics about electoral politics. So I actually wanted to, I know there's a few questions in the Q&A, and I encourage attendees to please enter your questions there, but maybe as an attempt to draw out some of the lessons from this global conversation, I wanted to ask you all to reflect maybe on two dynamics that seem so pervasive in the rest of the world, and in particular around the question of the politicization of identity, often ethnic identity, religious identity in Africa and Asia, and the ways in which that politicization of identity was largely taken to be a kind of exception, right? This is what makes these places not fully democratic, or not the normative model of democracy. But in this context in which, as Maurice was saying, we've seen this, in America it's always been politicized, but an extreme politicization, especially around racial identity. I wonder what are some of the lessons you think the experience of ethnic politics, the politicization of identity around the world sheds on how we might think about democratic politics more generally.
I'll quickly chime in. The polarization that we're seeing in the United States is something that I've experienced in my last 10 plus years researching two-party politics in Ghana, where one side says one thing and the other side completely disagrees with it, even if it's somehow the truth or something that's a fact. And the kind of distrust of the other side solely because you're polarized politically is something that, across the African continent, all the political systems deal with. And I think the way around it, there's no easy way around it. These are deeply rooted challenges that come out of a colonial system. And I think it's actually worth thinking about the United States, as a colonial system, and that we're not past that, because that is where some of this polarization lies.
If I could just add to that, and Adam, as you were saying, South Asian politics has always been haunted by kind of two concepts. One is caste and the other is communalism, right? So, despite the fact that there are political parties that are specifically are there to serve particular castes, their leaders belong to a particular caste, or that there are political parties who particular religious minorities as vote banks, there is still this idea that shouldn't be the case. That there is this, kind of a figure that's not beholden, or a subject that's not beholden to any of those affiliations of birth, right? But that is itself a fiction. And we have seen that, in kind of, if you look at the history of liberal political thought, that subject shorn of any kind of affiliations that you inherit through birth never existed. But if anything, I think now, in certain parts of South Asia. For example, if we look at the anti-CAA protests in India, in a neighborhood in Delhi, Shaheen Bagh, Muslim women asserted themselves as Muslim women, and they were not really part of this kind of anonymous crowds that are really important to make any kind of statement about popular politics, but they were very much making claims on the state and making claims about being included on the basis of communal identity without being ashamed of it, or without being being labeled as backward, or whatever, right? And I think that's a very important kind of unfolding that I don't know if we really exactly have the last word on it. But I do think that whenever we think that, we have to think about caste, class, ethnicity, race, and all those things in terms of places that somehow belong outside of, Euro-America, we have to remember that that subject has never really existed. It has always been a fiction.
And this, the CAA protests brings up a wider question, which all of you have touched on, which is this is a moment of lots of mobilization and lots of protests. And there's a question here about who the leaders are that are organizing these protests. Where is the kind of new forms of political leadership emerging in each of your respective contexts?
Well, one thing I could say that seems to be true in the context of the U.S. is that the formation of leadership is in response to what we learned from our elders. Now speak from the context of the movement for Black Lives, but our elders in the civil rights movement, as well as the Black liberation movement. And so we decidedly created a much more plural sort of concept of how we were going to organize, a decentralized, leaderful model of organizing, one where there wasn't one clear leader or one clear, cisgender religious figure, man behind a pulpit that is the avatar for our movement. That was very intentional. And, we've seen a number of movements sort of take a model similar to that, from Occupy, the Movement for Black Lives, to many of our other movements. And it's allowed for a lot of nimbleness, an ability to really grow exponentially, a lot of diversity of thought, and a lot of contestation within the movement, even as we grow and have a North Star. So we feel like we've learned from some of the limitations of past movements and the limitations of past sort of constructions of how you understand and how you organize leadership, and to decidedly have a more democratic, plural, decentralized sort of leadership structure.
Yeah, I would just add that in a similar way, most of these sort of protests in Latin America are not, often these protests would be led by the opposition political party or something like that. And today we're sort of seeing new formations emerge, often led by, in the Chilean case, for example, students have been at the forefront. But I would say sort of across the board, just this emergence of like young people who they don't have these memories of dictatorship. They are just really trying to make democracy live up to what they had been promised. But I would say, just sort of on the note of leaders, and to Maurice's previous point, sort of one of the notable things about the Colombian protest is that it is also is also an outcry against the murdering of leaders, of community leaders that has been rampant across various different types of movements. And so even just the kind of integrity of the very sort of life, the protection of life of leaders as a demand to the state is one aspect of the Colombian protest that I think is really notable.
Should I go to another? Oh, no, sorry. Did you want to say something?
No, sorry, I was nodding. But the one thing I did want to say, actually, it just reminded me that a lot of these recent protests all across South Asia, in Bangladesh, one of the most vibrant ones has been about road safety, where school children actually came out on the streets because they were protesting these road accidents, and it kind of spurred from this particular accident where 2 high school students were killed. And that became really huge, which was later kind of violently repressed by the state. But a lot of these movements that start as leaderless and kind of want to remain as such also have a hard time remaining as such. If you remember, the Indian case when Arvind Kejriwal, who was the head of the Aam Aadmi Party and kind of really, spoke against corruption, then became, Chief Minister of Delhi, he was then, kind of held responsible for all kinds of corruption and all kinds of, issues that kind of people consider as inevitable when you join big politics, So in many ways, leaders emerge sometimes organically, but to make any kind of difference, a lot of times you have to join forces, and that also delegitimizes your authenticity to a certain extent, at least in the South Asian case. Suddenly you become suspected of being a sellout, which is unfortunate, but that happens quite a bit.
Okay, we have one question here about pushing the global comparison. So Kaushik asks, given the general tendency towards American parochialism, I want to ask the panelists if there are specific elements of public discourse in other parts of the world that could be usefully incorporated into political struggles in the US, especially as we enter the various scenarios that Maurice was laying out. So I know Yanilda has to leave very quickly. So if you want a last minute word in there, we can start with you, and then maybe everyone else can close us out.
Sure. I mean, I think that one thing that I would say, and this hasn't always come across in these particular waves of protest, but I would say sort of social movements in general in Latin America have a much more straightforward human rights discourse. That it's much more a part of a language of everyday people's lives. This sort of sense that I have rights, and I have a right to have rights, and that these are demands that we have a right to make to the state. So things like having a right to healthcare, having a right to education, having a right to employment, having a right to housing, transportation, etc. These are sort of ordinary parts of people's discourses that I think we would look very different. And so sort of when the state fails, and to deliver on these things, people have a kind of a ready set of discourses to talk about it, which I think is much less the case in the United States.
The only thing I would add from that comment, like I agree. I actually think that the U.S. movement that in general has suffered from the parochialism and the sort of American exceptionalism, and has a long way to go to mature to be able to keep up with the rest of the world. And I appreciated the time that I spent in South Africa and some of the studying I did, because it gave me a framework that was very helpful in understanding the nature of what was actually taking place in the US. And the language, like the language of state capture, for example, was very, very helpful in as an organizer, wrapping my head around the forces at play here. But I would just cement that point that it's very, very true.
Just again, to add to that, I think when Trump got elected, I, among with a lot of my friends or interlocutors who were not American, we were just shocked that people were not on the streets. And this just would seem like such a kind of normal, I guess, or expected, predictable response if something like this happened in South Asia. And I think, I mean, there was the Women's March in DC, but I think it's Black Lives Matter and the way it has really exploded in this kind of most recent incarnation is something that made me feel that that maybe the American popular politics and, you know, the young people in America are actually open to lessons from the rest of the world. Because if you looked at the rest of the world in the last few years, starting from the Arab Spring, but most recently in Chile and Lebanon and other places, those, you know, those were very powerful visuals. And even for a kind of temporary moment, they created a lot of hope, and they have actually resulted in changes. And I think that's probably, I might be sounding very optimistic, but I really think people taking to the streets is the way to go. And Black Lives Matter has really kind of shown the path for us in the United States, but something that people in other parts of the world are more prone to do, it seems like, or more frequently do it.
I would just say that, and I think the activists and the mobilizers, if they could find a way to think about the term state failure and state breakdown in the US context, I think that's what we're experiencing in here. And we always apply that to other countries, but yeah. But I don't know how that would translate in terms of language.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much. So we're just a little over at 1:30, and I just want to thank you all for really excellent insights and for joining us for this first conversation. For our attendees who are still on the call, we'll have a second panel on October 23rd. You can find details on the 3CT website, and at that point we'll be just a couple weeks out from the election. So please join us then, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.